All right. So what I'm doing tonight isn't diving into any particular theme more specific than the wise men. I did what I would call a reasonably thorough study of everything that the heavenly doctrines have to say about the wise men and about this story. And I discovered some interesting things, and so tonight I'm going to be sharing them. Just to begin with, this is something that was brought to my attention a little bit ago. If we go to, Wikipedia, we find this wonderful web page called List of Common Misconceptions. In other words, things you think that are wrong. And so if we go to, where's my cursor? There it is. Christianity. Here we go. The Bible does not say that exactly 3 magi came to visit baby Jesus, nor that they were kings or rode on camels, or that their names were Caspar, Melchior, and Balthazar. 3 magi are implied because 3 gifts are described, and artistic depictions of the Nativity have almost always depicted 3 magi since the 3rd century, yes. So it became traditional very early on, but this is true. The Bible does not say that exactly 3 magi came to visit the baby Jesus, or that they were kings, or rode on camels, or that their names were, Caspar, Melchior, and Balthazar. Yes, or that's another tradition, that one of them was an Ethiopian. I have no idea where that one came from. The mentions at the bottom of that paragraph that there were efforts, some of this was derived from efforts to connect prophecies in Isaiah with the wise men, but it's not a connection explicitly made in the Matthew story. So, okay, let me close this. We really don't know that much about the wise men, and in fact, all that the word itself or the New Testament gives us regarding their origin and identity is this. They are wise men from the East. That's pretty much all we get. And if we look at some Greek, so that we can feel very smart, go home and say, I looked at Greek tonight. This is that same phrase in Greek. Yeah, isn't that interesting? Those words there underlined are the relevant ones: magoi, apo, anatolon. Magoi is rendered magi in English. It becomes magi when filtered through English, so that's where that word comes from. It's just a transliteration of what they are in the Greek. They're magoi. Apo is from, anatolon is east, and just as a tidbit, the part of the world now occupied by the nation of Turkey was once upon a time called Anatolia, because it's east of Greece. So this is all we got. They're magoi, magi, whatever that is, and they are from the east. So there's a map. You can't read it, I'm sure. It says Palestine under Herod's will, and at the time of Christ. So there's Jerusalem, there's the east. That's all we got. And of course, where I'm headed with all of this is that, well, actually, in the heavenly doctrines, there's quite a lot more said that really fleshes out the picture. So diving right into it. The wise men come up in context of discussion of the fact that Syria is called the land of the sons of the east. They who were in the knowledges of the good of faith were called sons of the east. The land of the sons of the east was Aram of Syria. And since by Syrians, or sons of the east, were signified those who were in the knowledges of good and truth, they were preeminently called the wise, as in the first book of Kings, where it said of Solomon, the wisdom of Solomon was multiplied above the wisdom of all the sons of the east. So these sons of the east are clearly associated with wisdom. That's the point being made there. And it goes on to say, and as in Matthew, where it said of those who came to Jesus when he was born, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem. And that passage, Carrie, yep.
In that passage that, therefore, it doesn't say in the word that they came from Syria, it says they came from the east. It specifically says in Syria and Aram aren't mentioned in the New Testament. It mentions that they were sons of the east because that represents the wisdom, not Syria and Aram.
Yeah, I don't have the whole passage up there, and I don't remember it that much detail, but I have a little bit more of the quote coming up here. And maybe this includes the part you just mentioned? No, I don't think it does. But yeah, I'll just read the rest of this and then speak to that. It says, in Syria were the last remains of the ancient church, and therefore in that land there remained the knowledges of good and truth, as can be seen from Balaam, who not only adored, that is, worshipped Jehovah, but also prophesied concerning the Lord and called him the star out of Jacob and the scepter of Israel. That Balaam was of the sons of the east in Syria is manifest, for he says this of himself when he utters the declaration, from Syria hath Balak brought me. That it was Aram or Syria where the sons of the east dwelt is evident from the fact that when Jacob went into Syria, he is said to have gone from the land of the sons of the east. Gone to the land of the sons of the east. And there's one more passage that mentions the wise men in context of discussing the meaning of Syria. That the wise men from the east who came to Jesus at his birth were of those who were called the sons of the east is evident from the fact that they were in the knowledge that the Lord would be born. They knew of his advent, concerning which things we read in Matthew, when Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea. Behold, there came wise men from the east to Jerusalem. That from ancient times such a prophetic knowledge had existed among the sons of the east, who were of Syria, is evident from Balaam's prophecy. So, there's what's before you. Sort of like Michael said, it's not about the wise men, it's about Syria and this idea of being the sons of the east. And the wise men are brought in more because it's of the discussion of the meaning of sons of the east. But Syria is mentioned here. And it does specifically say there was a remnant of the ancient church in Syria, and that remnant knew that the Lord would come. And that's evident because Balaam, who says he's a Syrian, clearly prophesied that the Lord would come. Oh yes, and I wanted to pause and just point out that the heavenly doctrines are consistent in calling them wise men, or in the Latin, sapientes, which is from sapientia, wisdom, and not calling them magi. So the Greek calls them magi. And you might say, if you were going to be a stickler based on that they should be called magi. And a lot of newer translations actually are calling them magi, not wise men. But the Latin is pretty consistent using a word that means wise, just interestingly. Coming to that. Based on what we've said right now, what I've covered so far, there's no basis for calling them kings, or for saying that there were three of them, which means, unfortunately, that we have to collect all the liturgies and tear number 956 right out. We Three Kings is coming right out, ladies and gentlemen, sorry. I know, it's my brother's favorite Christmas song. So, back to our map, there's Jerusalem, there's Syria. Not really east, it's more like north, northeast. But as we were saying, or seeing, the sons of the east had to do with the quality of these people, not where they were actually from. And obviously, in Syria or wherever, you're east of some people and west of others and north of others and south of others. It's not really about easterliness geographically. Yes?
It's not directions, it's a place. Like we talked about the Far East,
yeah.
or the Near East or the Middle East, and the Negev, which they translated as south, just means the place south of where they were writing.
Right. So to get hung up on...
In terms of compasses, because they don't have them.
Right. Exactly. So it's the land of the sons of the east as opposed to the place you get where you go east. Yeah. So that right there, it represented my understanding of the origin of the wise men right up until I dug a little deeper and did this study I was mentioning. So here is another possibility that the wise men were from, wait for it, I got to zoom out the map. There's Jerusalem, give or take a few dozen miles. And the contender is Sheba, right down there at the bottom of Arabia, or at least that's where modern scholarship guesses that the ancient kingdom of Sheba was found. It doesn't really have a strong correlation in a modern nation or ethnicity. Where does Sheba come from? Well, actually, Sheba is what all of the Old Testament prophecies of the wise men say. That's where the Old Testament prophecies of the wise men say they would be from. For example, in the Psalms, the kings of Tarshish and of the isles will bring presents. The kings of Sheba and Seba will offer gifts. Yes, all kings shall fall down before him. All nations shall serve him. And again in Isaiah, the multitude of camels shall cover your land. The dromedaries of Midian and Ephah, all those from Sheba will come. They shall bring gold and incense, and they shall proclaim the praises of the Lord. Now, clearly it mentions Sheba. It does mention gold and incense, which is, a interesting piece of evidence, but you could very well argue, well, this isn't necessarily talking about the Magi who visited the Lord at his birth. And I would have said the same thing myself, but in the Heavenly Doctrines, there are a couple.
Also, it says all those. That sounds like more than 3.
Yes, that is true. It does sound. Clearly in Psalm 72, we've got kings of Tarshish and the isles and Sheba and Seba. That's a lot of kings, and it's also, as are a lot of prophecies, phrased in a kind of superlative that makes you say, well, that was never going to be a literal occurrence. All kings. Well, no, not all kings in a literal sense. So you wouldn't be able to tie this concretely to the Magi in Matthew 2, but for a couple of places in the Heavenly Doctrines that make the connection explicitly. So, cool passage about gifts, actually, saying that because gifts captivate the mind and consociate, it was a custom in ancient times to give gifts to a priest or a prophet, also to princes and kings when they were approached. Thus, the wise men from the east brought gifts to the Lord just born, gold, frankincense, and myrrh, according to the prediction in David, and it supplies the citation, Psalm 72. And again, with the Isaiah one, going on to say, they came to offer gifts, and this is what was predicted in Isaiah, that they were to come from Sheba and bring gold and frankincense. So that's cool, having the Heavenly Doctrines supply that connection explicitly. And it also sort of is a chance to go meh to whoever wrote the Wikipedia article, because they were admitting that the idea that they were, no, they didn't admit that. I'll come back to that. I'll explain the meh later. All right. So Sheba is in the south of Arabia, and there are a couple other places that mention Arabia in association with the wise men. Here's a passage. Context is talking about the wise men. At the bottom of that last paragraph there it says, "Moreover, a star signifies the knowledge of good and truth. Because those in the east had such knowledges, they were called sons of the east. That those from Arabia were also so called is evident in Jeremiah. And sons of the east signify in the word the knowledges of good and truth. And Kedar, which is the ancient name for Arabia, has the similar signification." And if we follow that reference, Jeremiah 49, we find, "Thus says the Lord, arise, go to Kedar, and devastate the sons of the east." So Kedar the people of Kedar, like the Syrians, were sons of the east. So, case for Arabia being the origin of the wise men, looking fairly strong. One more passage, that wisdom flourished in Arabia is evident from the Queen of Sheba's journey to Solomon, also from the three wise men who came to the newborn Jesus, a star going before them. Yes, and you caught it. 3. Isn't that interesting? So, right, I mean, Sheba is southeast, Syria is northeast. Like Jim pointed out, it's not about the compass point. It's about and they got that name from their association with wisdom. Excuse me. So this was where I was going to say blah to the Wikipedia article writer. Bible doesn't say that exactly 3 magi came. Well, actually, the heavenly doctrines say that, at least in one place. Bible doesn't say that they were kings, but of course that Psalm 72 prophecy says kings 3 different times, calls them kings. Which raises sort of an interesting point. There's this tradition that these magi were kings, or they've been called kings for hundreds of years. This tradition that there were 3 of them. And then someone, some scholarly person since the advent of Wikipedia came along and said, well, no, you can't prove that. It's not in the Bible. And that's fair. It's a fair point that it's not in the Bible. But it makes me think that sometimes we get, we're too quick to throw out sort of our inherited traditions regarding the word. You got to hold them lightly, but if these events actually happened, which we believe they did, the gospel writers weren't the only people to witness them. There would be stories. There would be a memory of these events. And it's perfectly reasonable that some of our tradition is actually just an inherited memory of what happened. Now, it is also possible that the heavenly doctrines speak of 3 wise men simply because that's the tradition, and it's just a reference to our traditional assumption that there are 3 wise men. And it was in an unpublished book, so throw that in the pot and ruminate it.
But Jared, the Coronus quotation saying 3, that's pretty heavy because it would seem to have a divine approval.
Yeah, I mean, based on that, I would say there were 3. If you really have something on the line and you feel anxious about disproving it, you could try the whole, well, it's just speaking in terms of appearances because that was the tradition thing. But if that's an important fight to have.
It's one of the revealed works.
Yeah, that would be my belief too. Yep.
Back then, the tribes, they felt that their leader were kings.
Yes.
In the tribes. And they still have them now.
Right, and that was a point I was just going to get to. In what sense were these people kings? It is unlikely that they were the rulers of nations. That would be, that would be very unusual for the rulers of several different nations to all go together to a stable in Bethlehem and then not have other historical records of it. But in terms of clearly in the Psalms here, this is a prophetic passage, and it's speaking of kings because of the correspondence of kings, and kings that correspond to truth, specifically the Lord as regards divine truth, but also to those who possess truths, or just 2 truths that should govern our lives. And these wise men clearly knew important truths, and so maybe they're called kings in that sense, or just kings in the sense of being local leaders.
They are kings in their own right, and they're going to see the king of the Jews.
Yeah, and I think we still have to be careful about being completely confident that they were independently influential in material or worldly terms, but they were, being one of the Magi was not something that people would take lightly. That by itself was, you were a wizard, a magician. That was rare and significant. And they are called kings, which definitely makes them seem important.
Kind of sad that there were only three then.
Yes.
It doesn't say there were only three. It
No,
says
but
that
only
there were
3 went.
But it's
Yeah,
kind
dogs
of,
have 3 legs.
I've always been
They
kind
also
of
have 4 legs.
excited about the fact that maybe there were more than 3, and then if you go, really? There were only 3 were wise enough to go find the Lord?
Yeah. Well, I mean,
Yeah.
that does line up with the all of the passages in the heavenly doctrines talking about the state of the human race at the time of the Lord's birth are just, no holds barred talking about how rotten it all was. And it's always struck me that with the very notable exception of Herod, the Christmas story is full of really tender stories and moving evidence of integrity. Joseph, Mary, even Zacharias after he learns his lesson, and certainly the wise men themselves. A lot of really good people. It's really striking, and it's wonderful. But where are all these bad people? Well, maybe we see them sort of by omission. There were only very few who were willing to undertake the journey. So just very quickly, revisiting the Syria or Sheba debate. Again, it really doesn't matter. It's clearly not important to the story. I would say that the evidence seems to lean towards Sheba, but that could be roundly discussed. Just going to shift gears a little to talking about what the heavenly doctrines tell us about the origins of these people, or the nature of their knowledge specifically. We already saw an indication that they were a remnant of the ancient church. That's pretty well established. This passage here says that in ancient times there was a church in many kingdoms of Asia, as in the land of Canaan, in Syria and Assyria and Arabia, Ethiopia, Egypt, Chaldea, Tyre and Sidon, and elsewhere. But the church with them was a representative church, which means that all of their laws, all their acts of worship were symbolic. And at that time, the symbolism was actually understood, as opposed to the case with the later Israelite church. These representatives in their worship and statutes remained with many even to the Lord's coming, and thence there was the knowledge of his coming, as can be seen from the predictions of Balaam. That this knowledge was afterwards preserved is evident from this, that certain wise men from the east, when the Lord was born, saw a star from the east, which they followed. So they were a remnant of the ancient church. That church was spread around what we'd now call the Middle East or ancient Near East. Note that it does mention Syria and Arabia. And the basis of their knowledge was this knowledge of representations. And we know from other places in the heavenly doctrines that knowledge of representations was the source of the magic that's spoken of in the Word. And obviously in a lot of places in the Word, magic doesn't have a particularly isn't looked at in a particularly good light. The Old Testament law, you shall not suffer a witch to live, springs to mind. Not a positive sentiment towards witches. Magic's maybe not such a good thing. Well, the teaching is that there were good magi and bad magi, obviously, because the wise men were good magi. And it says that those were called magicians who were in the knowledge of spiritual things and also in revelations thence. And this is plain from the Magi who came from the east to Jerusalem. So, from their knowledge of spiritual things, they were able to receive revelation, which is clearly what happened with the wise men in the Matthew story. But there is an opposite sense. There is a dark side to magic. In that opposite sense, by magicians, such as those mentioned in Exodus, those who attend Pharaoh during the 10 plagues and replicate the plagues, turning their own rods into serpents and so on. These signify those who have perverted spiritual things and thereby have practiced magical arts, as is known, for magic was nothing else than a perversion and a perverted application of such things as are of order in the spiritual world. From this came down magic.
Maybe that's why they didn't call the kings, because they were sound like magicians were considered very good, right?
Yeah, that's probably true, actually, and particularly, at least, I believe they're called wise men in the Old King James translation. Is that true? The original King James translation? In any case, once upon a time, in Christendom, magic would have been just as out of favor as it was in the ancient Israelite church. Magic was the devil's stuff, so I think it was probably intentional to disassociate the magi, who were clearly good, from magic, even though the word magic obviously comes from magi. And our modern word magician is just a longer version of the word mage or magi. Sorry, what were you saying?
No, I said that's what it talks about, there was a perversion and a perversion. Doesn't sound much good to be called a major.
Yeah, and I think that, by the time of the Lord's coming, or even long before the time of the Lord's coming, most of the ancient knowledge of representations had been perverted, and so magic was, as a general rule, a perverse thing. And you get the impression that the wise men were a holdout, maybe the very last, who knows, the very last people who hadn't succumbed to this kind of perversion of the knowledge they had. In any case, that kind of knowledge doesn't seem to have endured since the Lord's advent, or if it does. Right, I was going to say, if it does endure, it's well hidden.
In that passage, it does refer to the wise men as magi.
Yeah, well, I mean, and this is from Exodus, where it's talking about Pharaoh summoning his magicians, and it sort of gives context saying, magi weren't necessarily bad, but most of the time they were. So that, yeah, they're named magi here when it's talking about magic. This is just another passage sort of shedding light on the quality or the nature of the stuff that they knew. It says the reason why the wise men from the east offered the gifts they offered was that among some in the east there remained from ancient times the knowledge and wisdom of the men of old, which consisted in understanding and seeing heavenly and divine things in those which are in the world and upon the earth. For it was known to the ancients that all things correspond and are representative, and consequently have a signification, as is also evident from the most ancient books and monuments of the Gentiles. Consequently, they knew that gold, frankincense, and myrrh signify the goods which are to be offered to God. And I like the clarity of that statement. It was about seeing heavenly and divine things in earthly and material things. They understood that connection, which we call the science of correspondences. And this passage here says very clearly that this was the knowledge of correspondences that survived among those in the East, even until the Lord's advent, as is evident from the wise men of the East who came to the Lord at his birth. And this was why a star went before them, why they brought gold, frankincense, and myrrh. The star that went before them signified knowledge from heaven, gold, celestial good, frankincense, spiritual good, and myrrh, natural good, from which three is worship. And this is a good segue to talking about the gifts they offered. You really don't have to be a New Church scholar with access to the heavenly doctrines to recognize that those gifts had symbolic value, particularly since these people are called wise men. You sort of can't help but wonder that there would be some hidden wisdom in the things they chose to offer. And gold, frankincense, and myrrh are substances whose symbolic significance is well attested to. So before I look to what the heavenly doctrines say about gold, frankincense, and myrrh, I just want to look at what's said about the use of these three things in the Old Testament, or the Old and New Testaments. First of all, with gold. I have visual aids with me. I actually have samples. The gold will be the least exciting because you're probably all wearing gold. You know what gold is like. But you... I've always put it in that one because that's the gold-colored box, but yeah. We'll have to wait for, the next society meeting to sort that one out. And the symbolism of gold in sort of a cultural sense, or just the obvious earthly symbolism of gold, is also pretty obvious. Gold symbolizes value, what's precious, because it's rare. And that's very well attested in the word itself. Passages like this one. The fear of the Lord is clean, enduring forever. The judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. More to be desired are they than gold, yea, than much fine gold. Sweeter also than honey and the honeycomb. So gold stands for that which is most to be desired. And again here, the gold standard, exactly. I will make a mortal more rare than fine gold. So gold is also symbolic of what is rare. Moving to less common substances. Oh yeah?
Also very significant that it's indestructible.
Right, doesn't tarnish.
Doesn't tarnish,
Yeah.
unlike anything else.
Yeah.
They find a sunken Spanish treasure ship from 500 years ago down there, and there's not even anything on it. It's just there, looking like it just came out of the mint.
Yeah, which is amazing.
Incredible, yeah.
And I wonder how aware of that the ancients were. I mean, they obviously could see with their eyes that iron would rust and gold wouldn't, but
They figured that one out.
yeah, it doesn't show up in the way that gold is talked about, but maybe it contributes to this idea of preciousness. Yeah. To love, yeah.
That it's the cleanest and the highest
Yeah,
in its purity of love.
yeah, very much agree.
Is gold an element of its own?
Yes, it is an element. Number 54 or something like that.
AU.
AU, that's right.
Hey you,
No,
oh, hey you, bring me some gold.
So the next gift is frankincense. I have some frankincense crystals. I encourage you to try smell them because the physical qualities of these things are actually really powerful, especially when we move on to talking a little more about their representation. Unfortunately, you have to inhale pretty hard because those crystals are fairly dry. Obviously, what you're supposed to do is burn them and fill the place with fumes that way. I did for the kids, yes. And we. Yes.
Went upstairs.
I did it in the chapel, yeah, because that space is able to absorb smoke without setting off alarms. And yes, we had a very military procedure where they sat in the pew and came up one at a time to inhale deeply. And my goodness, did some of them nearly get frankincense crystals in their nostrils when they bent down. But yeah.
I used to do it with kindergarten, but I used to just use incense, little pods I got, and burn them all the time I did worship.
That would probably be a lot easier to use. I think that
Well,
resin.
There's an incense burner, it's in the kindergarten, it should be still there, but you used to, when we walked it around and stuff.
I have just a little one, but yeah, those sensors,
Yeah.
they're nice because they allow you to keep airflow on the thing by swinging it. Yeah. So frankincense throughout the Old Testament is really directly associated with worship. And it was part of the incense that was burned in the tabernacle. It was, sweet spices, stacte and onycha and galbanum and frankincense, equal amounts of each. So that was the incense in the tabernacle. And the Israelites were commanded that when they made an offering, they were to burn frankincense with the offering or put frankincense on the offering. That's repeated a couple times, but here's one passage. When you make a grain offering, pour oil on it, put frankincense on it. So that association with worship, I think, is kind of a foundation for understanding the deeper meaning of frankincense. And the last one is myrrh. It does this sometimes. I had it lined up straight, but it's just the right size to get stuck. So frankincense, myrrh, like frankincense, is a resin or a sap. This is just the essential oil, distilled oil of myrrh from the resin. It's a lot stronger because it's an essential oil. You can, if you like, put some on your hands. Just be mindful that it is very strong smelling. And myrrh apparently was most often in ancient times used as in liquid form as a fragrance. It was used as a perfume. In the book of Esther, it talks about maidens being purified with myrrh for 25 days before they were sent to the king of Persia or something like that. So, it was a beautifying thing. Myrrh was also part of the anointing oil that was used in the tabernacle. So again, very important in Israelite worship. I won't read this whole thing, but it says, take liquid myrrh and a bunch of other stuff, mix it with oil, and that will be the holy anointing oil. No, this is not cheap stuff at all. No expense was spared. And here's a really interesting one. Only other place that myrrh is mentioned in the Gospels is in the crucifixion story. They brought the Lord to Golgotha, which is translated place of a skull, and they gave him wine mingled with myrrh to drink, but he did not take it. And when they crucified him, they divided his garments. Now, what exactly that was isn't 100% clear, but I have seen it said that myrrh is an analgesic or a numbing agent. So, and that makes sense, especially mixed with wine. It's a painkiller that he didn't take. Yes, which is very interesting, especially when you think of it as refusing a painkiller. Makes me think of Braveheart, should any of you know that movie. It'll numb me wits. Forgive my Scottish accent. Anyway, in Matthew, I think it is, what they give him is wine mixed with gall, which is vinegar, which seems like it would serve a different purpose. So I don't know. I don't want to make too much of that, but it's just interesting that they offered the Lord a painkiller when he was being crucified. And interesting to note that myrrh seems to have a medical function. It's also apparently been used as an antiseptic in some ancient and traditional medicines. I actually have a burn ointment that we were given that apparently they're using in some hospitals in Pennsylvania that has a bit of myrrh in it, which I was fascinated to discover. For for whatever that's worth. So just going now to the statements made in the heavenly doctrines about the meaning of these things, there's a whole bunch of them, and I'm going to list them all and then explain why I've done that in a second. It is a little repetitive. So the one you've already seen, gold is celestial good, frankincense is spiritual good, myrrh is natural good. And there's a bunch more that basically just say that. Celestial good, spiritual good, and natural good. Celestial, spiritual, and natural good. Gold signifies celestial good, frankincense, spiritual good, myrrh, natural good therefrom, with that interesting little therefrom idea added. Thus the goods of the three heavens. Gold signified celestial loves, frankincense, spiritual love, myrrh, these loves in the natural. Slightly different phrasing there. Here is a very different way of putting it. By gold there signifies the things of the good of love, by frankincense those of the good of faith, and myrrh those of both in things external. Gold denotes good, frankincense internal truth, and myrrh external truth. Both of these from good. So in one place, in a bunch of places myrrh is good, but here it's truth. So from good. And finally, gold signifies good, frankincense and myrrh, things that are grateful because from love and faith. And I threw this list of passages in order to say that these three gifts are all of these things. All of these things mentioned here, even though the way it's phrased is different, and it can be hard to understand how a substance like myrrh is at once everything that was said in all those different places. It can be hard to understand how those things are the same thing. And that's actually a really good jumping off point for talking about the way representations or correspondences work. So we have a natural substance, and I'm using myrrh as an example. And that red line is the dividing line between the spiritual and the natural. Myrrh is plainly a natural thing. It is literally tangible. I have some on my fingers right now. We can comprehend it. And myrrh corresponds to a spiritual idea, and the spiritual idea is bigger, because spiritual ideas are bigger than natural ideas. They're deeper, they're more profound, they're more full of meaning. And we, being natural, living in the natural world, cannot actually comprehend a spiritual idea. Can't see a spiritual thing. We can have it explained to us what that spiritual thing is. And so the heavenly doctrines do this a number of times with regard to myrrh. They tell us it's natural good. It's celestial and spiritual loves in the natural. Oops, what did I just do? Stop that. Go away. It's the love of good and of faith in things external. It's external truth from good. It's things that are grateful because from love and faith. So all of those are explanations of that spiritual thing that myrrh represents. But all of those are still natural statements. They're statements in natural language. And if you take a statement like celestial and spiritual loves in the natural, that's about as abstract and lofty as human language can get. But it's still words, words in English, which is a language that evolved not that long ago on a little island where it rains a lot. And my body is making the sounds of the English language. Language and the human thoughts expressed in language are always natural, and they can't comprehend that spiritual idea in its fullness. But by sort of putting all of these ideas together, you can start to sort of trace the outline of the real spiritual thing and maybe start to glimpse it. Because, of course, each of these phrases up here represents, it comes of seeing the spiritual thing from a slightly different angle, or approaching the spiritual thing from a slightly different angle. And I did a cool thing here. This is the best part of the presentation. See, you're approaching it from a different angle. And that's the power of representations or correspondences. Because myrrh, this little natural idea or this natural substance, holds all of that within it if we understand that. And so that, that little bottle of stuff that you passed around can, in our minds, become sort of a touchstone for so much stuff, and really more stuff that we can express or comprehend. And this little chart here doesn't even get into the fact that deeper than the spiritual meaning is a celestial meaning and then a divine meaning. It's sort of overwhelming how much truth there is coming to rest in these earthly realities, as it were. And that can start to give an idea how or why the knowledge of correspondences could be magical. These units, these substances, if we understand all the meaning lying behind them, are sort of incredibly dense little packages of knowledge that if you manipulate them, maybe cool stuff will happen. Right, or you could get yourself in big trouble. Yeah. So going back to gold, frankincense, and myrrh, they represent loves or realities on three different levels: the celestial, the spiritual, and the natural. But there's a couple other passages that I think really help to bring home what the point was of offering those gifts and why the Magi brought those gifts to the baby Lord. This one says, the reason why they offered these things to the Lord then born was that they might signify his divine in the human. For they knew what gold signified, what frankincense and what myrrh, because they were in the knowledge of correspondences. They gave the Lord these things to signify his divine in the human. In other words, they gave him gifts representing celestial, spiritual, and natural love because those things belong to the divine, and they were saying to the baby Jesus, we know that they belong to you too, because the divine is in you. And then this next one is my favorite passage that I'll share with you tonight. Talking again about their gifts. Excuse me. It says, the wise men from the east signified those who were in the knowledges of good and truth. Gold signifies celestial good, frankincense spiritual good, and myrrh natural good. That these had such a signification was still known to many in the east. Therefore they were called sons of the east, by whom in the word are meant those who were in the knowledges of truth and good. For the knowledges of correspondences had remained among them. Therefore, that they might testify to their joy of heart, they offered such things as signified every good from first to last. And that's the meaning of that trine. It's all things. And that's what they were saying when they gave those gifts to the baby. All things. All things belong to the divine that we know is here. And they understood something profound, and it gave them joy. They offered this to testify to their joy of heart. And of course, one of the wonderful lines from their story is this one: when they saw the star, they rejoiced with exceedingly great joy. And that particular phrase, exceedingly great joy, appears nowhere else in the Word, in the Old or New Testament. Great joy, variations on that appear very often, but exceedingly great joy, can't find anywhere else. It's very interesting. They understood kernel of something that just held so much within it. And I think their joy matched that. So I want to wrap up just by briefly going back to their story as it appears in Matthew and noting a few things, because the power and holiness and fullness of the Word is in the literal sense, the stories of the Old and New Testament. That's where all of that stuff comes to rest, in that natural thing, like we were seeing with the myrrh. And it's just cool to take everything that we've been talking about so far and try to hold it within the story, the very simple story. So, talking about wise men from the east coming to Jerusalem saying, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews?" Somebody already said, but very interesting that there's a lot of kings in this story, especially when we note that the wise men are kings themselves, and King Herod is a major figure, King of the Jews. When I first read this, I was thinking, wow, it was pretty bold of them to go to King Herod and say, "So where's the King of the Jews?" Herod might not have liked that. But having looked at it closer, I realized they're not necessarily getting an audience with King Herod as soon as they show up in Jerusalem. That's just the way we show it in our tableau. They might have just been walking around in the streets saying, "Where's the King of the Jews?" And of course, somebody sooner or later thought Herod ought to hear that and brought it to his attention. That seems to be what the text suggests, but maybe they were brought directly before Herod. It doesn't really say. And then in this next part, here it says he secretly calls the wise men. The first time it really mentions them being before him. Why secretly? Well, that's a good question. But anyway. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search diligently for the young child, and when you have found him, bring back word to me that I may come and worship him also." It's always struck me as schmarmy of him to tell them, "Go and search diligently," as if that's not what they'd been doing for who knows how many years or their whole lives. Clearly this was a labor of great study that they were finalizing. And here he is, "Okay, yeah, you go and work hard. I'll be here waiting." Anyway. When they heard the king, they departed, and behold, the star which they had seen in the east went before them, till it came and stood over where the young child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced with exceedingly great joy. And when they had come into the house, they saw the young child with Mary his mother, and fell down and worshipped him. And that word worshipped, a little more of an action word in Greek than it is in English. In our vernacular, you can worship looking like this, or like this maybe. But in Greek, that really refers to, yes, to sort of the concept generally of worshiping, but more specifically to the act of bowing down, and it's pretty graphic, face to the ground kind of bowing down. It has roots in the idea of being like a dog. So, really humbling yourself, which is reinforced by the statement that they fell down. And it bothers me that I can't find a single picture anywhere in the internet, my Google search, of them bowing down that completely. There's a lot of passages in the heavenly doctrines that say that that's the appropriate thing to do in the presence of the divine. It's the only appropriate thing to do, to fall down with your face to the ground. And again, I think they got it. Yeah. They understood just how much he meant, just how much was within this little baby. And It is. It really is. And that is all I have for you tonight.